The air turned metallic and thin, like breathing static electricity through a mouthful of copper coins. Kerrigan didn't need the primary dashboard's frantic red warnings to confirm the impossible. The Acheron was dying, and whatever was killing it wasn't a stellar event or a calculated attack. It was an absence. He was pinned to the cold shell of his cockpit, sitting on the known edge of blind spot 9, a patch of vacuum previously catalogued as merely inert. The routine required monitoring the standard energy gradient, but the consumption rate of background radiation, the constant ancient hum of the universe, had just spiked from 2 millikelvins to an unsustainable 47 in the span of 3 seconds. The environmental controls were screaming a silent alarm. Kerrigan knew the sound was muted only because the life support had already bled 60% of its reserve oxygen, trying to fight the thermal vacuum that seemed to be actively sinking the ship's heat signature. Kerrigan's hands, scarred and disproportionately large for his slender frame, moved with an economy of motion that belied the terror gripping his stomach. He ignored the flashing cryo-loop failures and focused instead on the Delta Visor interface. This high-resolution hardware was designed to translate multispectral light data into a navigable galactic map. When the visor cycled, it didn't show stars dying, fading, or exploding. It displayed a perfectly smooth, 20-degree cone of absolute physical nothing. No visible light, no heat, no energy signature above absolute zero. This was the true horror. It wasn't a black hole which radiated. It was a perfect consumer, a physical nullification field tearing at the tapestry of space-time. The console threw up repeated Protocol 7 Delta failures, data ingestion errors that tasted like ash in Kerrigan's mouth. The ship's internal chronometer registered time normally, tick for tick. Yet, the numbers for distance light flashing on the navigational console had shattered. One quadrant showed the closest marker, Rigel Station, as 4.2 light-years away, then instantly recalculated the distance as 20,000 light-years, then 0. Physics, Kerrigan realized with a chilling certainty, was being locally dismantled. He knew the foundational law ingrained since Academy. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change form. Yet, the scope showed a process that was violating this fundamental axiom. It was taking something, heat, light, information, and making it 0. This wasn't absorption, it was nullification, and the rate of nullification meant that the Acheron, small and powerful as it was, existed only as a temporary delay in the void's meal plan. He slammed his palm down on the comms switch, desperate to relay the raw data stream, but the atmospheric distortion, the literal vacuum of light and energy, was tearing the radio waves apart. He received static, a grinding noise like gravel rolling over dry ice, before the comms module shorted out completely. The last time he heard that exact static sound was 3 standard years ago on the Manticore Run, when the asteroid cluster shredded his forward shields, and he had been left floating for 9 hours, listening only to the cooling metal of his own coffin. The fear then had been cold and rational. This fear was primal, tied to the breaking of universal constants, the erosion of predictable reality. A harsh metallic hiss cut through the cockpit's struggling filtration system. The air pressure dipped violently, then equalized. Someone was forcing the main hatch seal from the external lock. The gravity stabilizers, fighting against the localized distortion field emanating from the void, flickered. Kerrigan felt his weight drop 3 full feet before the magnetic locks engaged again, holding him pressed hard against his acceleration couch. The access door slid open with a screech of tortured hydraulics. Fleet Leader Renard stepped inside the cramped cockpit. He moved with the heavy, unhurried precision of a man who believed his rank superseded physics. Renard was massive, dressed in the dark gray command armor of the Central Defense Mandate, which seemed designed specifically to remove any hint of vulnerability. He carried the stale, slightly burnt smell of recirculated air from the main cruiser, the Triumph. Renard didn't look at the warning lights. He looked only at Kerrigan. "Status report, pilot." Renard's voice was a low, grinding baritone, entirely devoid of urgency. "Protocol 7 Delta failure, distance matrix compromised, background radiation consumption. It's anomalous, sir. Beyond known metrics. We are being actively drained." Kerrigan's voice was strained, fighting the sudden dryness in his throat, but his eyes never left the scope. He had to capture the data. The numbers were the only proof, and without them, the entire sector would assume this was a temporary equipment malfunction. Renard didn't move closer to the data terminal. He merely tilted his head, assessing the pilot, not the crisis. "You are ordered to cease logging and initiate immediate jump prep for retreat to the Triumph." Kerrigan tightened his grip on the data spool actuator. This was the moment that sealed his fate, one way or another. "Sir, I need to complete the final acquisition sequence. We have less than 3 standard minutes until core collapse. The rate of energy decay implies a spatial distortion event on the far side of that darkness. If we jump now, we lose the vector data. This is crucial, Fleet Leader. This isn't a nebula. This is fundamental physics being overturned." Renard finally took a step forward, the heavy boots echoing slightly on the weakened deck plates. "I repeat, pilot, retreat. The Triumph is holding the line 20,000 clicks back. This capsule is expendable. You are expendable." Kerrigan felt the familiar surge of righteous fury, the same misplaced arrogance that had landed him on this dreary passive monitoring run in the first place, a consequence of prioritizing the mission over the chain of command 3 standard years prior. He had lost his cruiser, his crew, and his fast track to command defending a position the brass had deemed strategically irrelevant. Now, Renard saw him as a low-level data drone, disposable, and maybe he was right. He hesitated, just a flicker, half a second dedicated to resentment and the desperate need to prove the magnitude of the threat, instead of simply obeying the man who held the keys to his future clearance. That half-second of ego cost him everything. Renard didn't wait for a response. He reached out with a thick, gloved hand and slapped the hard override button for the data spool release. The physical feedback was a sickening clunk. As the core memory bank disengaged, the magnetic seal breaking the write cycle prematurely, Kerrigan stared at the blank console where the final, crucial spectral map should have been processing. The data was incomplete, corrupted, unusable. All those impossible numbers lost to a physical disconnect. "You just deleted the only proof, sir," Kerrigan whispered, the fear finally giving way to a cold, profound realization of utter failure. His body felt heavy, hollowed out. Renard didn't apologize. He merely breathed a slow, calculated sigh, turning back toward the hatch. "Data is meaningless if the analyst is dead, pilot. You prioritize life. I prioritize the mission parameter, passive observation, not confrontation. Now get out of that couch. You are relieved." Kerrigan slowly began unlocking his restraints. The metallic, thinned air was making his joints ache. He tasted defeat, sharp and bitter. He looked up at Renard, who was already halfway through the exit hatch, eager to be back on his gilded command ship. Then, as Kerrigan unbuckled the final safety strap, the Delta visor, which Renard hadn't bothered to look at, suddenly flickered back to life for one final agonizing moment. It didn't show the 20-degree cone of absolute absence. It showed structure inside the absence. There were geometric shapes within the darkness, rigid, unyielding structures that absorbed every photon but reflected none. They shouldn't have been visible at all. Their presence violated the core physics of light, of energy, of observation itself. They were perfect, complex shadows cast by non-light. Renard paused at the hatch, sensing the shift in atmospheric tension. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes falling, finally, on the monitor display. The fleet leader entered. Kerrigan didn't need to whisper. The words simply left him, a soft, choked expulsion of air as the implication of the structures clicked into place, bypassing all logic, hitting straight at the soul. No. The scope showed what was eating the stars nearby. It wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was something engineered. And in that same instant, the primary energy gauge on the Acheron bottomed out completely. The secondary life support systems failed, plunging the cockpit into silent, cold darkness, leaving only the impossible, glowing geometry of the alien construct reflected in Kerrigan's unblinking eyes. The shadows were moving. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, but the violent vacuum of all working energy. The gravity locks failed completely, the abrupt cessation throwing Kerrigan against the cold deck plates. He didn't feel the impact immediately. The residual static charge on his skin felt like 1,000 tiny needles, momentarily numbing the nerves. He scrambled, fighting instinct to keep his eyes open, forcing himself to breathe deeply, the thin, recycled air leaking from his emergency suit, reservoir. Fleet leader Renard, weighted by the heavy, segmented command armor, impacted the hatch frame with a dull, sickening thud. The armor, built for high G acceleration and micrometeoroid defense, was useless in zero gravity unless manually stabilized. For the first time, Kerrigan saw the fleet leader's composure shatter. Renard let out a strangled, muffled curse, thrashing briefly as his massive form bounced off the console, narrowly missing the delicate optical array. Kerrigan understood immediately. Renard was conditioned to command, not survival. He was too large, too reliant on systems that were now slag. Pilot, status. Renard's voice crackled through the comms override, laced with genuine panic. "No status, sir," Kerrigan answered, his voice a strained whisper, fighting the chill that was already seeping through the insulated suit lining. "We are dead in the water, full energy drain. The core collapse was instant." Kerrigan stabilized himself against the pilot couch frame, using the built-in magnetic strips activated by his suit boots. He reached for the emergency power shunt, a handle hidden deep beneath the dash panel. It was designed to pull a suicidal 20% reserve charge directly from the jump drive capacitor, enough for a single, desperate burst of communications or 5 minutes of life support. "Initiate life support reroute immediately," Renard barked, finally grasping a handhold. "Then prepare the external locks for retrieval. The Triumph will be on approach." "Negative on reroute," Kerrigan said, pulling the shunt handle. The move demanded physical effort. A faint smell of burnt ozone, sharp and metallic, filled the air, indicating the violent energy transfer. "The drive core is compromised. If I reroute power to life support, we drain the capacitor completely. We need this reserve to stabilize the magnetic field for external latching. We're being pulled towards the void." The Acheron, now a cold husk, was losing its battle against the nullification field's gravitational edge. Kerrigan could feel the subtle, constant pull toward the absolute cold he had just witnessed. He bypassed the life support entirely, diverting the precious 20% charge into the secondary maneuvering thrusters' field coils, effectively turning them into rudimentary repulsors. The thrusters whined, spitting out a meager, visible field of crackling violet energy, a desperate push back against the unknown. Renard floated closer, his faceplate reflecting the frantic red status lights still flashing uselessly in the dead console. "You disobey a direct order, pilot. I ordered life support first." "You ordered survival, sir," Kerrigan retorted, securing the field coil bypass with a locking pin. "We survived the null field first. The Triumph Won't risk entry if we're drifting past the boundary. Now, prepare to manually assist external docking. We have maybe 4 minutes of repulsion before the coils burn out. Renaud was furious, his breathing heavy, but he complied, the sheer weight of his armor now forcing his movements to be slow, deliberate. The power dynamic had inverted. Renaud was an officer, but Kerrigan was the only engineer with access to the ship's vital organs. As Renaud struggled to open the secondary maintenance panel, Kerrigan felt the exhaustion weigh on his chest. The thin air, the cold, the failure, it all pressed down. He saw the ruined data spool lying near the entry hatch, a reminder of his loss, and the loss of everything the universe needed to know. It wasn't the first time he'd seen evidence destroyed by arrogance. He closed his eyes briefly. The smell of copper and ozone instantly dragged him 3 standard years back, not to the Manticore asteroid field, but to the debriefing room, sterile and smelling of bleach and false professionalism. The Admiralty's investigation focused only on the Triton's destruction, his cruiser, not on the illegal mining operations he had uncovered. He had presented the data, hard proof of a massive systemic failure, but they had filed the report under strategic overreach and equipment failure. The fact that a full platoon had died, including Lieutenant JL, who had been ordered by Kerrigan himself to hold position despite the clear tactical disadvantage, was simply a footnote. He followed the order. Kerrigan had learned then that data, especially inconvenient data, was often less valuable than the narrative of command. His insistence now, his refusal to retreat without the spectral map, wasn't about science. It was about honoring JL's memory and erasing the guilt of Manticore. He couldn't let critical information be erased by ineptitude again. He opened his eyes, the memory fading like a bad frequency. The fear of being a footnote, expendable, was replaced by the cold determination to prove the fleet leader's incompetence, even if it cost him everything. The Triumph reports jump drive readiness, Renaud announced, his voice tight with controlled relief. But they are holding position. Commander Tarrant is requiring full stabilization lock before they commit. The distortion field is interfering with their internal gyroscopes. Of course it is, Kerrigan muttered, his breath clouding slightly in the frigid cockpit. The void wasn't just out there, it was physically affecting the local physics. We are the stabilizing anchor. We have to push further back. He moved swiftly to the damaged navigation terminal. The field coils were generating a repulsor force, but the power drain from the void was still outpacing the input. They were stabilizing, but still drifting. Kerrigan began typing in a complex sequence, bypassing all safety protocols on the fusion cells. He was aiming for a complete, momentary magnetic reversal of the hull, a burst of energy so powerful it would feel like a punch in the face of the null field, pushing the Acheron 20 kilometers clear in a fraction of a second. The system was never designed to handle this. It was a guarantee of permanent ship damage. "What are you doing, pilot?" Renaud demanded, observing the complex key sequence. "Bypassing the maneuvering thrusters, preparing a full hull field reversal. We need distance, not just stability. Tarrant won't jump until we are out of the immediate gradients." Renaud stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the dash. "That will destroy the secondary systems entirely. We won't have heat, even in our suits, if we do that. We have to wait for the Triumph to approach, not risk permanent field damage." "Sir." Kerrigan looked up, meeting Renaud's eyes through the reflective glass of the helmet. "We don't have time. Look at the energy curve." Kerrigan pointed to a tiny secondary display that was still drawing power from a tertiary battery. The consumption rate, after a brief stabilization from the thrusters, was beginning to climb exponentially again. The void was adapting. It was pulling them in faster than before, recognizing the resistance. The data wasn't just showing energy loss. It was showing intelligent, structured consumption. This isn't just a black field, fleet leader. The geometric structures I saw, they are not passive. They are responding to our resistance. They are increasing the pull. We are attracting its attention. Renard finally looked at the tiny display. His jaw visibly slackened. The numbers didn't lie. The field was treating the Acheron like an annoyance to be quickly consumed. I won't authorize a full reversal. It is an unacceptable risk to personnel, Renard stated, clinging to the rule book even as reality dissolved around them. Then you are authorizing the destruction of the Triumph. Kerrigan stated plainly, tapping the final sequence. If we stay here, we drag them down. They won't risk their 3,000 souls for my zero-gravity coffin. He hit execute. The cockpit screamed with a high-pitched tearing noise, not of air, but of metal stress. The violet energy field intensified to a blinding white. For a moment, Kerrigan felt his weight increase violently, gravity seeming to return at 4 times the standard rate, crushing him back into the pilot seat. His vision tunneled. The sheer magnetic force pushed the Acheron hard. The inertial dampeners, already dead, offered no resistance. Kerrigan felt a sharp, cracking pain in his ribs. Renard cried out, his bulk slamming into the far wall with brutal force. Then, silence. The pressure vanished. The light faded. The repulsor coils were gone, vaporized by the overload. They had achieved distance, but at a severe cost. Report, Kerrigan gasped, fighting to regain breath. His chest tightened painfully. He checked the display. They were clear of the most dangerous part of the energy gradient, floating 23 kilometers out. Triumph confirms jump lock, Renard rasped, struggling to move. He sounded winded, possibly injured. Tarrant is initiating jump sequence now. Relief, sharp and sudden, flooded Kerrigan. He had saved the main fleet asset. He had fulfilled the primary objective, even if he had destroyed his own ship in the process. But then, the emergency comms crackled back to life, energized by the residual spike. It wasn't Tarrant's voice. It was highly filtered, digital static, followed by a sequence of numbers that looked like an internal ship's designation. It was the Triumph I's central core computer, bypassing all voice filters and protocols, running on pure, terrified algorithm. Warning. Structural integrity breach at 50%. Hull plating 4 and 6 compromised. Localized nullification field detected within forward hangar bay. The voice stopped, replaced by a sound that made the hair stand up on Kerrigan's arms. A grinding, rhythmic, metallic vibration, impossibly deep, like a mountain being dragged across concrete. Renard, nursing his arm, stared at the comms unit. What was that? They secured the jump vector. They should be clear. Kerrigan looked at the delta visor, now completely dark, but his memory supplied the image of the engineered shadows. They hadn't just followed the Acheron. They had used the brief window of the magnetic reversal to track the larger energy signature. The void had not consumed them from the outside. It had learned how to cross the boundary. The scope showed what was eating the stars nearby. Sir, Kerrigan whispered, tasting blood in his mouth from the internal strain. It wasn't a static field. It's a mechanism, and we just delivered the target right to its doorstep. He pushed off the pilot seat, ignoring the stabbing pain in his ribs. He had 30 seconds of residual energy left in his suit's tertiary heating coils, and the Acheron was a frozen coffin drifting toward oblivion. He reached for the manual eject lever on the side hatch. This is Commander Tarrant. We have a hull breach. Repeat, internal breach. Emergency evac protocols initiated. Renard, the object you found has breached our containment. The jump drive is offline. We are trapped. Tarrant out. The comms died again. The silence returned, this time heavier, carrying the weight of 3,000 lives now trapped in a cruiser 20 kilometers away. The grinding sound, however, was now closer, amplified by the vast, cold vacuum. Kerrigan pulled the eject lever. The hatch failed to open. He pulled it again, harder, Realizing the sudden deceleration had fused the external hydraulic seals, he was trapped. He looked across the dark cockpit at Renard, the man who had prioritized his mission over the proof, who was now trapped alongside the very evidence of his failure. Kerrigan grabbed the ruined data spool, the one Renard had physically disconnected, and slammed it against the wall, breaking the casing. He didn't care about the data anymore. He needed a weapon, or at least a tool. Inside, embedded in resin, was a tiny, high-frequency energy emitter, useless for data storage but still capable of generating a small, focused microwave pulse. He began working the emitter loose, his fingers numb with cold, knowing he had to reach the Triumph before it became another absence in the night sky. He couldn't save his crew from Manticore, but he might save 3,000 souls from the engineered horror he had just witnessed. He looked at the fused hatch, then at Renard, who was staring blankly at the dead comms panel. "Fleet leader," Kerrigan said, his voice flat, devoid of respect or fear. "We are not evacuating. We are boarding." He finished prying the emitter loose, the pain in his ribs a dull throb. "Now, help me get this hatch open before those things realize we are still broadcasting residual heat." Kerrigan felt the distinct pressure drop as the temperature inside his suit fell below 2 degrees standard. He knew the grinding sound wasn't the Triumph collapsing, but the engineered shapes, those shadows of non-light, using the large cruiser as a scaffold. They were not just consuming energy, they were building something. And whatever they were building, Kerrigan was about to step right into the middle of it. The cold was the first enemy, a physical, invasive force that bypassed the suit's depleted heating coils and sank directly into the marrow. Kerrigan knew the sensation well. It was the proximity of absolute zero, the edge of the physical nullification field. He grabbed Renard by the shoulder plate, the massive armor surprisingly slick and unresponsive in the zero-G environment. "We need to melt the external seals, sir. 3 seconds of pulse directly on the hydraulic junction. Then you crank the manual lever while the metal is still hot," Kerrigan instructed, his voice low and tight, already feeling the ache in his fractured ribs intensifying with the exertion. Renard, still dazed from the sudden deceleration and the failure of the Triumph's jump, fumbled with the tiny energy emitter. The device, designed only to corrupt storage data, felt laughably inadequate against the sealed, high-pressure hull of a scout ship. "I understand the principle, pilot. Give me space." Renard's attempt at authority sounded thin, cracking under the pressure of the moment. He pushed himself toward the hatch frame, his movements slow and generalized, lacking the precise economy Kerrigan's slender frame had mastered. Kerrigan stabilized Renard against the deck, providing the anchor the fleet leader's bulk couldn't achieve. He watched as Renard pressed the emitter against the hydraulic lock, activating the pulse. A faint, visible shimmer of heat rose, accompanied by a sharp, chemical sizzle as the freezing condensation vaporized instantly. 1 second. 2. "Now, sir." "Crank." Renard shifted, letting go of the emitter to grasp the manual lever. The emitter, designed for delicate internal work, clattered against the hull and tumbled away into the darkness of the cockpit. Kerrigan watched it go, the realization of losing his only tool hitting him with the force of a physical blow. Renard didn't notice. He was focused entirely on the lever, grunting with effort. The cold had already begun to counteract the brief heat pulse. The lever moved barely an inch, then locked solid. "It's fused, pilot." The hull stress was too great. Renard's breathing labored inside his helmet. He looked at Kerrigan, frustration momentarily eclipsing fear. Incompetence. The word echoed in Kerrigan's mind, tasting like the metallic copper from Manticore. Renard had wasted the crucial pulse, prioritizing his own execution of the command over efficiency. Kerrigan slammed his gloved hand against the wall, not from anger, but from the brutal realization that 3 standard years hadn't changed anything. The cost of bureaucratic arrogance was always paid in blood and lost opportunity. "We don't have time for this," Kerrigan hissed. He pushed off the wall and retrieved a piece of sharp shrapnel from the shattered data spool. He didn't try to melt the seal again. He went for the internal locking bolts, using the shrapnel as a crude pry bar. This was not the standard procedure. This was mutilating the vessel. He had to force the mechanism through physical damage, hoping the pressure equalization system didn't fail catastrophically. The physical strain was immense. The pain in his ribs spiked into a blinding, white-hot line of agony, forcing a suppressed gasp. He felt dizzy, the cold and the physical exertion draining the meager oxygen reserves of his suit faster than his lungs could compensate. Finally, with a screech of tortured metal, one of the 3 internal bolts sheared. The pressure differential hissed violently, pushing the hatch outward just enough for Kerrigan to wedge his hand in the gap. He grabbed the hatch frame and pulled with all the desperate strength he had left. The sound that followed was louder than the metallic shriek. It was the sudden cessation of the deep, rhythmic grinding coming from the Triumph. Silence, absolute and total, descended upon the void. It was not the silence of peace, but the quiet of focus. The entities had stopped consuming haphazardly. They were listening. Kerrigan froze, sweat chilling instantly beneath his helmet lining. He was floating with the half-opened hatch, his position revealed by the vibration and the minor heat signature, bleed. "They stopped," Renard whispered, finally grasping the gravity of the change. "They found us," Kerrigan corrected, pushing off the hatch with a final searing surge of pain, sending the Acheron spinning slightly toward the Triumph's direction. He had to create inertia. Standing still was death. They were now 20 kilometers from the cruiser, drifting slowly, 2 human targets clinging to a frozen metal coffin. Kerrigan needed a shield, a method of movement, or both. He looked at Renard, calculating the fleet leader's mass and the inertia required to push them both toward safety. "Sir, we need to use your armor as propulsion. Activate your low-G maneuvering jets on full burst. 5-second count, pointed away from the Triumph," Kerrigan ordered. Renard hesitated. "Those jets are calibrated for micro-adjustments only. A full burst will burn them out. We need those for docking stabilization. The Triumph is breached, fleet leader. We are not docking. We are entering a war zone. We burn those jets now, or we float right into the Null Field's hunting range." This time, Renard complied instantly, perhaps recognizing the sound logic in the insanity. The jets flared, a violent, brief expulsion of residual chemical energy. The force pushed the Acheron forward toward the target cruiser. Kerrigan used the sudden velocity change to launch himself and Renard off the Acheron's cold shell. They became 2 rapidly moving specks of metal hurtling through the vacuum toward the massive, dark silhouette of the Triumph. Kerrigan kept Renard slightly ahead of him, using the larger armor mass as a rudimentary shield against potential debris, or worse, thermal scanning. His ribs felt like shattered glass grinding together. He had pushed himself far past exhaustion. He noticed his field of vision was tunneling rapidly, a sign of oxygen deprivation. He closed his eyes briefly, remembering JL, the dead lieutenant who had waited 9 hours for a salvage team that never came, because Kerrigan had prioritized data over life. This time, the data is inside the ship, Kerrigan told himself, trying to convert guilt into functional energy. This time, the living are the proof. They were halfway to the Triumph when the comms crackled again, overriding the emergency silence. It was a data burst, short and sharp, too organized to be static, too fast to be voice. Kerrigan, a former communications specialist, instantly recognized the highly encrypted protocol. Mandate override Alpha 7. He activated his internal decryption sequence, the process demanding a concentration he barely possessed. The pain flared, blurring his focus. The raw data stream stabilized. It was a request for Command Key 079er, Renard's specific fleet scuttle authorization code. The transmission source was the Triumph as secondary command bridge. The second officer is requesting the scuttle code, sir. Kerrigan rasped, the urgency cutting through the pain. Commander Tarrant must believe the ship is beyond salvage. They are trying to initiate self-destruction to prevent the technology from reaching the enemy. Renard's massive frame stiffened. Scuttle? Impossible. Tarrant is a rational man. We must stabilize the containment breach. Sir, Tarrant is gone. They called out your name before the feed died. This is the next officer in the chain trying to save the fleet. If those things gain access to the Triumph's jump drive schematics, the war is over before it begins. The mandate, override. Alpha 7 protocol was the ultimate failsafe, guaranteed destruction of the flagship, the main asset, to prevent catastrophic intelligence transfer. The key was held in 3 parts, one of which was Renard's personal biometric code. Give them the code, Renard. Now, Kerrigan demanded. Renard shook his head, a slow, heavy motion in the darkness. No, I will not authorize the destruction of my flagship. I will regain control. We have a moral imperative to save those lives, not sacrifice them to a protocol. You have a moral imperative to prevent the technology we delivered from falling into enemy hands, Kerrigan shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He felt a sickening surge of betrayal. Renard, clinging to the illusion of control and the sanctity of his command, was about to doom the entire sector. De mal en pire. From bad to worse. The old Terran adage hit him like a physical blow. Renard's ego had destroyed the data, and now his pride was about to destroy the fleet. Kerrigan saw the ghost of Manticore in Renard's eyes, the same stubborn refusal to admit defeat. The secondary comms channel, running on a highly illegal deep scan frequency Kerrigan kept active, pulsed with a new data stream. This wasn't encrypted. It was the Triumph's internal diagnostic log. Kerrigan deciphered the feed instantly. The entities, the geometric shadows of non-light, were not just draining power. They were rapidly integrating the Triumph's life support and weapon systems into their own operational structure. The hull breach was just an entry point. The grinding sound wasn't consumption, it was assembly. The Void had found a way to weaponize a human cruiser. Sir, they are repurposing the main battery. If we scuttle now, we destroy the weapon. If we wait, they fire it at the fleet, Kerrigan pleaded, the cold realization sinking deep into his core. Renard remained stubborn, his large gloved hand already reaching for the manual suit comms panel to broadcast his refusal. I will not condemn 3,000 souls on your word, pilot. We are going to board and stabilize. Kerrigan knew Renard would refuse the scuttle code. He also knew that if Renard reached the Triumph, he would activate the main power banks in a desperate attempt to regain control, handing the entities a fully charged weapon system. There was no time for discussion, no room for morality. The cost of visibility had to be paid. Kerrigan pushed off his own magnetic boot clamps and lunged forward, using the residual momentum of their shared trajectory. His good arm wrapped around Renard's massive neck. The action flared the pain in his ribs so intensely that his vision went momentarily black. He didn't stop. He grabbed the heavy, segmented wrist of the fleet leader's command armor, the wrist holding the manual comms panel, and began applying focused, brutal pressure, fighting the inertial dampening field of the suit itself. Renard roared, a muffled, panicked sound inside the thick helmet, thrashing wildly. He was strong, massive, but untrained in zero-G combat. Kerrigan used leverage and pure desperation. drawing on the years of suppressed rage and guilt over Jael's death. I will not let this failure be repeated. He pressed harder on the fleet leader's wrist until he heard the sickening crunch of the wrist seal fracturing, rupturing the low-pressure integrity of the glove. The hand controlling the comms went limp instantly, paralyzed by the vacuum exposure. Kerrigan immediately shoved Renard away, sending the massive, flailing body spinning toward the hull of the Triumph, which was now looming dangerously close. The sudden movement, however, cost Kerrigan the last of his focus. He had won the fight, preventing the immediate catastrophic error. But he had been loud, chaotic, and exposed. Just as Kerrigan felt the faint, metallic kiss of the Triumph as whole magnetic fields catching his own suit, his suit comms flared with a priority broadcast. It was not the second officer. It was a chillingly composed, automated voice from the Triumph Central AI, activated by the critical systems breach. Scuttle sequence. Unauthorized delay in command. Key 079ers transmission detected. Initiating emergency core overload protocol beta. Time to complete 90 seconds. Kerrigan slammed his remaining functional hand against the Triumph E's hull, feeling the magnetic locks engage. He looked up. The massive cruiser, 20 kilometers long, was beginning to hum with an unnatural, violent energy. It was going to explode. He had saved the fleet from an enemy weapon, only to ensure the destruction of 3,000 lives. And then, just ahead of the exploding cruiser, 3 perfect geometric shadows detached from the hull, moving with impossible speed directly toward the 2 human figures. The grinding sound was back, louder, closer, right beside his head. They had sensed the violence, the thermal discharge, and the imminent energy spike. Kerrigan had 60 seconds to breach the Triumph and stop the scuttle, or he would die alongside the symbol of his latest, most profound failure. He was trapped between the ship's self-destruction and the engineered horror moving in the darkness. The magnetic locks screamed a tortured, high-frequency sound, the only protest the Triumph could manage as its central AI began executing its own death. Kerrigan used the brief, violent surge of magnetic force, a byproduct of the core overload protocol, to rip his helmet's emergency torch from its bracket. He didn't have time to find a secure entry point. He needed to get in now, before the ship became an expanding sphere of superheated metal. He looked down at Renard, the massive suit still attached to the hull via its own failed magnetic boots, the fleet leader effectively unconscious from the brutal zero-G maneuvers, and the fractured wrist. Kerrigan had no choice. He ignited the torch, a searing, white-hot beam that sliced through the pressurized airlock maintenance hatch beside the main hangar bay entrance. The metal hissed, spitting molten slag into the vacuum. This wasn't standard operating procedure. It was a desperate mutilation. The geometric shadows, having covered half the distance from the hull, paused, sensing the sudden, concentrated thermal breach. The second Kerrigan felt the airlock plate buckle, the internal magnetic field of the Triumph seized him, pulling him violently through the opening he had cut. The force was crushing, the impact flaring his fractured ribs into a scream of white pain. He landed hard inside a maintenance conduit, the metallic, ozone-laced air of the cruiser rushing past him. He was inside the Triumph. 30 seconds remaining. He scrambled into the adjacent chamber, which was not a maintenance area, but a dimly lit, high-security data nexus adjacent to the forward hangar bay. The temperature inside was abnormally low, and the internal gravity felt unstable, vibrating slightly. Kerrigan didn't see crew members, only banks of flickering data terminals, all running the same repeating sequence. He ignored the flashing red alarms and forced himself to focus on the central data interface. He needed the scuttle override, the sequence to stop the countdown. But as his eyes scanned the active logs, the immediate threat of explosion receded, replaced by a cold, stomach-churning horror. The geometric shadows weren't just assembling a weapon, they were using the cruiser's enormous processing power for data processing and transmission. Kerrigan recognized the primary data stream immediately, the spectral map, the corrupted, incomplete data he had risked his life for in Part 1, the map showing the cone of absolute absence and the engineered structures was not lost. The entities had consumed the data spool when Renard disconnected it and had been using the Acheron's residual energy to upload the partial map into the Triumph's core during the brief period of proximity. We didn't just deliver a target, Kerrigan realized, bile rising in his throat. We delivered the key. The enemy wasn't interested in the Triumph's jump drive schematics for navigation. They were interested in the Borj Kekushin, their trajectory projection algorithms. Used by the fleet's high command data packets, the spectral map provided the raw input data, the location of the engineered shadows, and the Triumph systems provided the processing power to calculate the most efficient vectors for an assault on the Central Defense Mandate's main shipyard, the entire rationale for the fleet's existence. The transmission countdown was running parallel to the scuttle sequence. Time remaining to core collapse, 20 seconds. The automated voice echoed through the cold chamber. Kerrigan slammed his hand onto the console to override the scuttle, but his eyes caught the small data window beside the countdown timer. Transmission sequence integrity, 92% complete. If he stopped the scuttle now, the Triumph would survive, saving the 3,000 souls aboard. But the transmission would complete in the next 2 seconds, giving the engineered entities the complete route map, ensuring the annihilation of the entire defense fleet and likely the populated worlds they protected. This was the impossible calculus, the cold, brutal choice that had haunted his nightmares since Manticore. He looked at his hands, encased in the heavy gloves, the metal dull and scratched. Hands that were good at fixing things, good at saving lives individually, but now these hands held the power to commit the worst war crime in the sector's history. To let the ship explode was to murder 3,000 innocent people, a betrayal of the life he was fighting to save on Manticore, the memory of Jael who died following a catastrophic decision. I cannot kill 3,000 people out of cowardice, but to save the Triumph was to allow the transmission, ensuring the deaths of 3 million in the colonies. I cannot save the 3,000 and condemn the millions. Kerrigan squeezed his eyes shut. 3 years ago, he had chosen the mission data over Jael's life, and he had paid with profound guilt. Now there was no mission outside the immediate survival of the human species, and the human species was losing the numbers game. Time remaining to core collapse, 10 seconds. The transmission gauge hit 95%. It was almost too late. He calculated with savage military pragmatism, filtering out the rising panic and the agonizing pain in his chest. Renard had refused the scuttle out of pride, attempting to save his flagship. That pride would cost countless lives. Kerrigan, the disgraced pilot, had to embrace the role of executioner. He had to prioritize the macro survival. But stopping the data was not enough. The entities were already integrated into the ship's systems. If the Triumph exploded, the resulting energy discharge would likely be consumed by the geometric shadows, feeding them immediately. He needed to destroy the data, but he also needed to ensure the explosion didn't turn into a quick meal for the enemy. Time remaining to core collapse, 5 seconds. Kerrigan did not press the scuttle override to stop the countdown. Instead, He typed in a complex manual sequence, overriding the standard core collapse protocol. He was aiming for a SUI, localized, targeted detonation of the ship's primary communications array and the central data core, a surgical strike designed to sever the transmission antenna and corrupt the remaining data, sacrificing the Triumph's bridge and command structure instantly while delaying the full core overload by 30 seconds. It was a desperate gambit to save a few more minutes for the crew in the engine rooms and barracks. It was murder for a purpose, packaged as sabotage. He hit execute. The digital clock on the console vanished. The automated voice cut out mid-sentence. The effect was instantaneous and violent, not a massive explosion, but a sharp, localized implosion. The lights in the Nexus chamber flickered to a dark red emergency setting. The gravity dropped out completely for a sickening moment, then returned with a violent, unstable oscillation. Kerrigan felt the distinct pressure wave of metal buckling nearby. He knew, without doubt, the central data core had imploded, the transmission was severed, the fleet was safe for now. But the cost was immediate. Through the smoked glass of the Nexus, he saw the three shadow entities. They were no longer moving toward him with exploratory speed. They were moving with purpose, galvanized by the sudden, intense, localized energy collapse. The biggest shadow entity, a rotating octahedron of non-light, detached entirely from the hull and floated directly up to the reinforced window. Kerrigan had saved the fleet from the information, but he had just announced his presence to the weapon. The entity began to integrate with the glass itself, absorbing the heat and light, tracing the outline of Kerrigan's suit through the transparent aluminum. Then, a data stream pulsed through Kerrigan's emergency comms channel. It wasn't the Triumph's AI. It wasn't Renard. It was a single, high-frequency broadcast that bypassed all known human encryption, transmitting straight into his suit's audio buffers. It wasn't a language. It was a sequence of images, geometric diagrams, and chillingly, a single, clear image of the Acheron's cockpit taken moments before the Triumph was breached. An image that showed Kerrigan and the reflection of the engineered shadows in his visor. The geometric structures were not alien mechanisms. They were sentient observers. And the images they sent him were not threatening. They were educational. They showed the spectral data corrupted by the initial disconnect, the numbers scattered and useless. Then they showed the data reconstructed, complete, thanks to the Triumph's processing power. The greatest horror, they had allowed the scuttle sequence to run, knowing the resulting energy spike would complete the data transmission. They were not just taking energy, they were orchestrating events, manipulating human responses to achieve their goal. And the final image that flashed across the optical display of his helmet was not a star chart, but a close-up of the geometric entity he had seen in the Delta visor, intricate, complex, and beautiful. Then, overlaid on the image, a single Terran word translated with cold precision: welcome. Kerrigan was not fighting a natural phenomenon or a simple invading species. He was fighting a technological intelligence that viewed him not as a threat, but as a crucial, chaotic variable in its own strategic computation. He realized his fatal error. He had sacrificed 3,000 lives to stop the information from transmitting, but the entities had intended the scuttle, the blast, the data flow all along. His panic and desperation had been accounted for. He had performed the action the enemy wanted, sacrificing the innocent to save the collective, and the collective was still in danger. Kerrigan backed away from the pulsing glass. He needed a way out now, before the full core collapse hit. He looked over the console, desperate for any uncompromised system when his suit registered a physical impact. Renard, the fleet leader, had drifted through the open breach in the wall, propelled by the instability of the environment. His body slammed into Kerrigan, knocking them both hard against the far wall. Renard's voice, muffled and panicked, crackled through the comms. "Pilot, report. We must stop the core collapse." Kerrigan stared at Renard, the man whose arrogance had started this whole chain of failure, now demanding a reversal of the inevitable. "I can't stop it, fleet leader," Kerrigan whispered, tasting the absolute defeat. "I started it." And then the geometric shadow on the window moved. It didn't try to consume the hull. It projected something onto the metal, a new image for Kerrigan. Not a strategic map, but a simple, archived video log from the Triumph's own historical files. It was Commander Tarrant, the second in command, 3 standard weeks ago, sitting at the main bridge, and Tarrant was speaking directly to the camera, addressing a message to Renard, the fleet leader, and giving him a final, detailed command. Tarrant's voice, clear and professional, confirmed the absolute betrayal. "Fleet leader, Renard, if the nullification field entities show any signs of intelligent integration, you are ordered to sacrifice the Acheron and its pilot, Kerrigan, immediately. The pilot's data logs showing the nature of the engineered structures are the central threat. We have set the Acheron's secondary transponder to broadcast those raw logs the moment its core collapses. Their consumption is necessary to distract the enemy while the Triumph executes its jump and retreats to mandate territory. Kerrigan is an expendable asset, Renard. You knew this when you assigned him to Blind Spot 9. Do not allow his actions to compromise the defense." Kerrigan stared at the image, numb. He hadn't been an engineer who screwed up the mission. He was the planned, necessary sacrifice. He had been sent to Blind Spot 9 not for observation, but to die, giving his raw data to the enemy as a calculated distraction. Renard, struggling against the wall, looked at the video log, his eyes wide with horror, not at the treachery, but at the fact that Kerrigan had now seen the orders. Kerrigan finally understood the true weight of Manticore, of JL, and of his own life. He was never a pilot. He was a lure, and he had failed to follow the protocol for which he had been deemed expendable. The geometric entity flashed one final message on the glass, a sequence of coordinates. Not for the human fleet, for the hidden, private jump coordinates of fleet leader Renard's personal escape pod, coordinates Renard had illegally kept secret from the Triumph's logs. The entities were not interested in killing Renard. They were interested in sowing absolute chaos and isolating their new variable. Kerrigan stared at the shadow, then back at Renard, the man who knew he was meant to die here. Time until full core collapse, 3 seconds. Kerrigan grabbed Renard's armor, not in anger, but in cold, purposeful determination. He had sacrificed the 300 for a lie. He would not sacrifice the millions for the truth. He needed a jump drive, and Fleet Leader Renard had just been exposed as a necessary tool. Kerrigan shoved Renard toward the nearest intact bulkhead access panel. He had stopped the destruction, but now he had to use the betrayal. He was going to use Renard's own private escape route to escape the dying ship, ensuring the disgraced fleet leader was forced to carry the weight of the lie alongside him. He was no longer a pilot or an engineer. He was a weapon, and his first act was to take a hostage. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The violence of the localized implosion didn't register as a sound, but as an acute pressure differential, an internal tidal wave of tortured metal and compressed atmosphere. The air in the Nexus chamber immediately dropped in temperature, tasting thick with burnt electrical components and the sudden chemical tang of high-energy particle fallout. Kerrigan gasped, the action sending a blinding shock wave through his ribs, confirming the fractures were serious, perhaps critical. He had bought them 30 seconds, not of escape, but of delay. He had to move Renard. The fleet leader was dead weight, his heavy command armor a liability. Kerrigan managed to loop his good arm beneath Renard's armpit, securing the massive body with his magnetic boot locks against the deck, dragging him across the cold, vibrating metal floor toward the bulkhead marked Egress 7 Delta, the rumored, highly illegal access point to Renard's private escape capsule bay. Coordinates, Kerrigan hissed into the fleet leader's private comm frequency. The escape coordinates, now fleet leader. Renard was regaining consciousness, but his movements were sluggish and uncoordinated, hampered by the vacuum exposure to his hand and the general system failure of his suit. Kerrigan, you destroyed the ship, you murdered them, 3,000 souls. I saved 3 million from your arrogance and Terran's betrayal, Kerrigan retorted, the words flat and devoid of emotion. He stopped arguing morality. It was irrelevant now. The coordinates, Renard, or I leave you here to be consumed by the blast. He pressed a specialized override pin into Renard's suit control panel, cutting power to the helmet's internal atmosphere recycler. Renard's frantic, muffled protests instantly turned into struggling silence as his air consumption spiked. Control 079er, Renard gasped out, the panic immediately breaking through his moralizing. Sub-frequency access required. Personal biometric lock. Kerrigan stabilized Renard against the bulkhead, using the fleet leader's thumb to override the biometric scanner on the access panel. The process was agonizingly slow. Every second was amplified by the constant, deep tremor of the Triumph-E's core winding up for its final, fatal release. The panel clicked open, revealing a narrow, cold maintenance crawl space dimly lit by strobing red lights, the path to the forbidden escape pod. Kerrigan shoved Renard through first, following him into the cramped tube, fighting gravity that kept violently cutting in and out. The engineered shadows outside the Nexus chamber had noticed their egress. Kerrigan risked a glance back toward the reinforced glass. The largest octahedron, the one that had transmitted the chilling welcome, was still there, but it wasn't forcing entry. It was tracking them, moving slowly, maintaining a deliberate distance. It knew where they were going. They want us to leave. The realization was a crushing psychological blow, heavier than the physical pain. Kerrigan hadn't escaped the battlefield. He had been permitted to retreat. His desperation to use Renard's secret jump pod was merely the next, predictable step in the entity's equation. They were weeding out the disruptive variables, the chaotic element, Kerrigan, and the ineffective element, Renard, were being encouraged to isolate themselves for easier study, or perhaps for disposal outside the energy-rich environment of the Triumph-E's impending blast zone. Kerrigan felt the last reserves of his suit's tertiary heating coils vanish. The cold instantly became painful, sinking deep into his bones, a sharp, constant reminder of the void he was trying to escape. He shoved Renard toward the airlock leading to the pod bay. Get inside. Initiate pressurization. Renard, realizing the total failure of his command authority and the loss of his flagship, collapsed onto the pod's small magnetic platform. He was broken, weeping silently into his helmet. Kerrigan ignored the pitiful display. He sealed the emergency airlock and slammed his hand onto the pod's control terminal. The interface flickered to life, showing a bare-bones system, minimal life support, basic navigation, and a limited communications array. The entire design screamed clandestine. He input Renard's coordinates, a hidden station 4 sectors away, far outside the jurisdiction of the Central Defense Mandate, Renard's self-made retirement plan. As the pre-jump diagnostics cycled, Kerrigan felt the exhaustion finally reach critical mass. His vision blurred, not from the cold, but from sheer mental collapse. He He leaned his head against the cold metal bulkhead. Why was he still fighting? He had murdered 3,000 people to prevent a strategic information transfer that the enemy had already accomplished. He was a fugitive, a traitor, and a murderer, dragging along the man who was supposed to be his sacrifice. The entire Mandate now believed him to be an enemy agent who destroyed their flagship. The entire arc of my life, the resistance, the sacrifice, the guilt over jail, it was all predictable, all accounted for. He thought of jail, waiting 9 hours for the salvage ship that never came because Kerrigan insisted on retrieving data. He thought of the 3,000 faces now trapped in a collapsing ship because Kerrigan chose data integrity over their immediate lives. I am not a hero trying to save the world. Kerrigan realized, the auto-judgment hitting him like a physical blow. I am a man running from the responsibility of having failed jail. I tried to erase that guilt by choosing the macro survival, but all I did was compound the initial failure, playing right into the hand of an enemy that understood my fear better than I did myself. If the entities were already 3 steps ahead, if they knew his entire behavioral algorithm, what was the point of taking this pod? He would only delay his inevitable, calculated death. It would be easier, morally cleaner, to open the airlock now and simply freeze in the vacuum. Let the cold take him. Let the failure be complete and final. He closed his eyes, tasting the coppery tang of exhaustion in his mouth. He allowed the despair to sink in, profound and paralyzing. This was the bottom of the well. There was no honor, no purpose, only the crushing weight of being a pawn in a game played by a species that used human panic as fuel. A low, throbbing alarm, muffled by the layers of metal, ripped him back to consciousness. The core collapse countdown was complete. The Triumph was seconds away from detonating. Kerrigan forced his eyes open, ignoring the nausea and the freezing pain. He stared at the escape pod terminal. The console displayed a simple red text error. Jump drive inactive. Panic, cold and sharp, replaced despair. Renard's escape pod didn't have a standard jump drive. It was too small, too localized. It was only capable of limited sublight propulsion to reach the nearby hidden station. Renard, who was now watching Kerrigan with an unnerving, vacant stare, finally spoke, his voice thin. "It's only a shuttle, pilot. It runs on chemical impulse. We won't make it to the station before the blast wave." Kerrigan had committed murder and taken a hostage, only to find himself trapped in a conventional shuttle with a suicide blast seconds away. He had failed completely, but then, as his eyes frantically scanned the terminal for manual impulse ignition, he saw it. A tiny, almost invisible wire running parallel to the main navigation bus, separate from all standard Mandate protocols. It ran directly into a compartment labeled Auxiliary Power. Renard's paranoia, his illegal secrecy, had exceeded the boundaries of the expected. He had hidden more than just coordinates. Kerrigan slammed his glove against the panel, overriding the auxiliary power lock. Inside the compartment, nestled amongst conventional batteries, was a cylindrical device no larger than a forearm. It hummed violently, radiating a dangerous contained energy signature. A Mi micro-jump core, illegal, unstable, single-use, designed for a rapid, short-distance jump, powerful enough to vaporize the shuttle if miscalculated by half a millisecond. The core was not connected to the main navigational software. It was a crude, direct wire connection to the impulse thrusters. It was designed by Renard to execute an immediate escape jump, bypassing all safety checks, straight to his hidden base. Kerrigan knew the risk. The inherent instability of microcores was legendary. They were a 50% chance of success, 50% chance of being torn apart in the void. But it was a chance. The hull of the Triumph shuddered violently, the beginning of the final energy release. He grabbed the microcore's manual activation switch, a cold piece of metal attached to a frayed wire. He had to input the coordinates manually, directly into the core's buffer, bypassing the shuttle's entire system. If he miscalculated the jump trajectory by 1 degree, they would rematerialize inside the geometric shadows, or atomized in deep space. Kerrigan stared at Renard. "I need 20 seconds of stable atmosphere pressure. Can you hold the system?" Renard, perhaps realizing the alternative, nodded slowly. "I can manage that, pilot. Get us out." Kerrigan didn't hesitate. He began typing the sequence, his fingers numb, relying only on muscle memory and the burning determination to not let his final act be a passive surrender. The jump destination was Renard's hidden station, but he realized if he went there, the entities would follow. They had tracked Renard's private coordinates. He needed to change the destination, to inject a massive amount of chaotic energy into the entity's predictive model. He changed the last 3 digits of the hidden coordinates, replacing the safe, secluded destination with the nearest known gravitational well aberration. A high-risk anomaly 50 light seconds from the Central Defense Mandate's main shipyard. He was jumping them into a zone of pure gravitational chaos, hoping to destroy the entity's ability to track them, or at least gain a few precious hours of unobserved time. It was not an escape plan. It was an intentional act of tactical suicide. He completed the input, his breath catching in his throat. Warning: gravimetric fields destabilizing. Core breach imminent. The shuttle's primitive safety system screamed, overridden by the proximity of the Triumph's imminent demise. Kerrigan slammed his hand onto the microjump core switch. In the same instant, through the pod's single, reinforced viewport, the dark, geometric octahedron that had been tracking them lunged forward, closing the remaining distance in a fraction of a second, attempting to adhere to the escape pod's fragile hull. Kerrigan felt the pressure of the jump drive seize his body, a wrenching, sickening force, just as the entity made contact with the glass. The view outside the pod dissolved into the swirling, impossible colors of hyperspace. But as they entered the jump, Kerrigan saw the entity. It wasn't attached to the hull. It was inside the jump field, with them, a perfect dark shadow projected onto the collapsing reality. Kerrigan realized his final chaotic variable had been absorbed. The entities were no longer passive observers of his escape. They had learned how to ride the wave. He had traded immediate death for a chase through the very fabric of space-time, and he had brought his hunter with him. The view outside the pod dissolved, not into the expected clean field white of hyperspace transition, but into a dizzying smear of impossible colors, purples and deep, burning oranges that defied known thermodynamics. Kerrigan didn't need the navigational displays to know the microcore jump was catastrophically unstable. The very fabric of his reality was shearing, and the shuttle's internal magnetic fields were oscillating so violently that every joint in his body screamed in protest. He was thrown hard against the control console, the impact grinding his fractured ribs together. He bit back a cry, focusing on the dark silhouette of the geometric octahedron that was projected onto the collapsing reality just beyond the viewport. It was not adhering to the hull. It was riding the distortion wave, a perfect shadow in a storm of non-existence. "Pilot, stabilize. The field is tearing us apart." Renard's voice, raspy and panicked, cut through the emergency comms. The fleet leader was still secured to the deck, his bulk jostled brutally by the failed dampeners, but alive. "It is tearing us apart, fleet leader. That's the point," Kerrigan gasped, fighting the nauseating yaw of the unstable jump. He gripped the manual control yokes, his fingers numb with cold and residual electrical discharge. The microcore, crude and directly wired, responded to input with the brute force of a runaway train. He was aiming for the gravitational well aberration, a target he hoped was so chaotic it would exceed the entity's predictive model. But the entity was already adapting. A data stream flashed across the jump field, bypassing the shuttle's minimal shields and projecting directly onto Kerrigan's internal visor optics. It was a grid, overlaying the chaotic colors, a perfect mathematical prediction of the shuttle's trajectory. The chaotic impulse Kerrigan had injected calculated precisely, second by second, toward the singularity. The entity hadn't been confused by chaos. It had absorbed the chaos as data. The projection pulsed, displaying a sequence of numerical variables labeled Kerrigan A5 Delta, failure response. Below it, the entity presented a chillingly accurate graph of Kerrigan's emotional state since Manticore, correlating his guilt over JL with every self-sacrificial tactical choice. They weren't fighting Kerrigan's actions, they were utilizing his psychological flaws. You sought to erase failure by choosing the macro sacrifice. You are predictable, pilot. Kerrigan felt the chilling logic of the antagonist slice through the thick haze of his physical pain. He had tried to choose the morally difficult path, believing the price of 3,000 lives would secure the defense of the sector. The entities had planned for his desperate altruism. They wanted him to stop the scuttle, thereby trapping himself in this jump field with them. They needed a ride out of the blast radius, and I provided the illegal taxi. If the entity knew the final trajectory, they would simply wait until the microcore stabilized and then resume their consumption or capture. Kerrigan had traded a quick explosion for slow, predictable death. He looked down at the micro-jump core, humming violently. His failure wasn't the macro sacrifice, or the corrupted data, or even getting trapped. His central, enduring failure was prioritizing data, the scientific truth, over the simple human reality of survival 3 years ago. His adherence to principle had killed Jail. His adherence to principle had destroyed the triumph. He had to choose the non-principle. Kerrigan ignored the calculated prediction in his visor. He slammed his functional hand against the auxiliary power compartment, ripping out the crude data buffer wire connecting the core to the navigation system. Renard screamed, muffled, as the loss of even that minimal data stream sent the shuttle tumbling violently into a spin. The jump field turned black, then erupted in strobing blue static. "What are you doing? We need the buffer," Renard cried, struggling against his restraints. "The buffer knows where we're going, Fleet Leader. They know where we're going. I need to make the jump illogical." Kerrigan pulled the ruined data spool from his suit, the incomplete, physically damaged proof that Renard had ripped from the Acheron in the first place. The data he thought he'd lost, the data that led to this entire confrontation. This data was useless for navigation. It was a scattered map of non-light, filled with physical contradictions, unusable for any logical jump calculation. It was the purest form of error. He forced the spool's connection cable into the exposed wire port of the micro-jump core, performing a full, destructive injection of corrupted data directly into the core's unstable buffer. The core whined, spitting visible sparks. The intentional data overload was so toxic, so illogical, that the system should have instantly shut down or vaporized. Instead, the jump field outside changed. The smooth, predicted chaos was replaced by a churning, impossibly sharp energy field. The colors fractured, geometric shapes within the void shifting randomly, defying all physics. The geometric entity in the viewport paused. The mathematical projection in Kerrigan's visor glitched, displaying a string of zeros and non-computable errors. Error, prediction, model failure, variable input, non-sequential. Kerrigan grinned, a painful, cracked expression that felt like blood in his freezing suit. The entity understood structure, energy, and human behavior. It did not understand total, self-inflicted, meaningless data suicide. "That's my failure, Fleet Leader," Kerrigan whispered, tasting the irony. "I value unusable data more than my own life." They didn't calculate that. The micro-jump core was now screaming, a high-frequency shriek of metal under impossible stress. The corrupted data was tearing the single-use core apart, injecting random, destructive variables into the space-time navigation sequence. The shuttle was no longer heading for the gravitational well. It was heading for a random, calculated impossibility near the well. The geometric entity launched itself at the viewport, no longer observing, but attacking, trying to integrate with the hull to stop the chaotic input. Kerrigan felt the temperature in the pod drop instantly by 10 degrees, the heat draining away through the reinforced glass. Kerrigan didn't flinch. He grabbed the manual override lever for the core, a mechanism designed only to initiate a premature exit. He didn't want a controlled exit. He wanted an abrupt, destructive end to the jump, right at the peak of the calculated absurdity. "We are exiting now," Kerrigan stated, pulling the lever. The shuttle did not slow. It did not decelerate. The jump field snapped. The sensation was not that of movement, but of instantaneous, violent reformation. Kerrigan felt every cell in his body pulled and compressed simultaneously. His vision went white, then black. The pressure was immense, far exceeding the rated tolerance of the shuttle. He heard a sickening, resonant thunk beside him, followed by the catastrophic sound of metal warping. When vision returned, it was dark, cold, and silent. They were floating, surrounded by the debris of their own jump. The gravitational well aberration was visible directly outside the viewport, a massive purple tear in space, shimmering with chaotic energy, a location too unstable to harbor conventional life, too dangerous to monitor. They had successfully jumped into the statistical equivalent of a cosmic car crash. Kerrigan checked his environment. The escape shuttle was barely recognizable. The hull was ruptured in 3 places, vented to the vacuum. The minimal life support was gone. The micro-jump core was slag. The interior atmosphere was leaking rapidly into space. He turned toward Renard. The fleet leader was slumped over his restraints. The impact forces had exceeded the rating of the heavy command armor. The helmet was cracked along the seam, and the internal life support feed was dark. Renard was motionless. Kerrigan was alive, but he was trapped in a dying vehicle with a broken body and a rapidly depleting oxygen supply. He pushed the environmental comms override, only static. Renard was dead, killed not by the enemy, but by Kerrigan's final, desperate, unpredictable action. He scanned the immediate vicinity for the entity. It was gone. Or, at least, the large octahedron was gone. Kerrigan felt a prickling sensation on his skin, a ghost of the absolute cold that had saturated the jump field. He looked at the shattered console, which was still drawing minimal power from a residual capacitor. On a blank status screen, a single, flickering geometric projection materialized, a smaller, cleaner, simpler shape like a shard of the larger octahedron. It wasn't attacking. It was observing from a distance of perhaps 20 kilometers, nestled within the shifting gravitational chaos of the aberration. It had been violently ejected from the jump, but it had survived the chaotic transfer. The entity had been forced out of the shuttle's immediate proximity by the illogical data input, but it had learned. It was now analyzing the results of the forced, chaotic exit, adapting its model for random, variable absorption. The confrontation was over. Kerrigan had achieved the maximum possible success, forced separation from the main threat, isolation of the enemy, and physical survival. He had paid for it with the lives of 3,000 crew, the destruction of the flagship, the death of his hostage, Renard, and severe, probably fatal, internal injuries. He leaned back, resting his head against the frozen metal, ignoring the sharp, tearing pain in his chest. His visor optics flickered, and the smaller entity projected one final image into his field of view, the graph of his psychological state, now stabilized, predictive, and labeled with a single update. Kerrigan, A5 Delta, calculated chaos accepted, new model integrating. The entity didn't display hate or defeat. It displayed satisfaction. Kerrigan had not defeated the intelligence. He had taught it how to handle unpredictability. He had been the ultimate test subject. He had won the skirmish, but lost the long war. The entity was still out there, learning, waiting for him to make the next predictable move. Kerrigan raised his good hand, his fingers twitching uncontrollably from the neural shock of the jump. He looked at the wreckage of the shuttle, the dead fleet leader beside him, and the impossible, intelligent shadow waiting in the darkness. He had committed treason, murder, and high-level sabotage. He was a fugitive, trapped with the ultimate threat, in a location that should kill him within the hour. But he was alive, and he held the truth, even if no one would ever believe the word of the man who destroyed the Triumph. He was not a pilot, nor a hero, nor a scapegoat anymore. He was the sole surviving data point of an intelligence that used human failure as a strategic weapon. And the first thing he had to do was find a way to communicate the truth of the entity, a truth born of absolute failure. Before the cold claimed him, he activated his suit's emergency diagnostics. The report was grim: pressure rapidly failing, oxygen critical, suit temperature 0, and a radiation exposure that guaranteed death within days. Kerrigan closed his eyes, accepting the mathematical reality of his situation. He had outsmarted the mandate, outmaneuvered the entity for a moment, and fulfilled his morbid obligation to himself and the memory of Jael. He did not die as a pawn in someone else's clean equation. He opened his eyes. In the dying light of the shuttle, he noticed a tiny, unexpected flicker on the defunct comms panel, a minuscule, highly localized frequency spike running on an ancient, forgotten mandate cipher. He had jumped into the gravitational well aberration, a zone considered absolutely lifeless. But the comms panel, receiving a broadcast from somewhere nearby, was whispering a single clear message, repeating in a loop, "Triton, we are holding the line. Repeat, Triton, we are holding the line." The Triton, his old cruiser, lost and destroyed 3 years ago on the Manticore Run. The ship where Jael died. The entity was not the only thing waiting in the impossible darkness of the aberration. Kerrigan realized his random, chaotic jump, fueled by the memory of his guilt, had dropped him directly into the one place he was truly needed. He had less than an hour to live, but for the first time in 3 years, he had a mission that wasn't about data or lies. The days that followed were different, slower, heavier. Kerrigan woke not to the freezing cold, nor the crushing pressure of G-forces, but to a dull, throbbing warmth, the sensation of life support functioning properly for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. He was lying strapped to a crude medbay bunk, the air thick with the smell of sterilized metal and low-grade nutrient paste, utterly foreign after the ozone and burnt copper tang of the Acheron. His ribs were bound tight, his left arm immobilized. A tube ran into his neck. He looked up at the ceiling. It was low, patched with mismatched plating, and humming with a reassuring, quiet power signature. Not the furious, panicked whine of the Triumph's core, but the steady thrum of long-term survival. He felt the pain, deep and pervasive, but it was a manageable pain, not the acute agony of immediate death. A woman in a worn civilian uniform, her eyes hardened by years in the deep dark, leaned over him. She wasn't a doctor, she was a mechanic. "You survived the jump, pilot," she said, her voice gravelly, without expression. "Against the odds. You brought the whole entity right to the doorstep, but you pulled it into the vortex with you. Took us 3 standard days to pull your shuttle out of the gravitational chaos. We had to wait for the entity to retreat. The entity retreated? Kerrigan managed, his voice a dry rasp. It calculated the risk and decided your chaotic energy wasn't worth the thermal expenditure, the woman confirmed, adjusting his IV line. It's still out there, watching, but stable. It knows we're here now, but it also knows this aberration is too energy-intensive to bother with permanent surveillance. Too much noise for the signal. Kerrigan understood. He hadn't defeated the geometric structure. He had merely made himself temporarily uninteresting. He was too chaotic to compute efficiently. His final, desperate act was a data dump of illogical noise. Renard? Kerrigan asked, the name tasting like ash. The fleet leader? Dead. Crushed by his own armor in the deceleration. We recycled his life support reserve, but the body, we ejected it into the aberration. Appropriate ending for a coward with a secret jump pod, I suppose. Kerrigan closed his eyes, accepting the final consequence of his actions. The 3,000 lives of the Triumph were vaporized. Renard, the man who knew the betrayal, was gone, and the entity was still functional, having integrated the lesson of chaotic variables. But the woman knew the truth, and the reason for his salvation was now laid bare. The signal we sent you, the woman continued, tapping the side of his bunk. It was running since Manticore. That was our post-mortem protocol for Triton. We never lost the faith. We were hiding here, waiting to intercept the inevitable inquiry. We were the inquiry. The survivors of the Manticore run, the crew Kerrigan believed he had abandoned 3 years ago, had built a small, functioning deep space retreat within the gravitational well aberration. They were the true defense, operating outside the Mandate's treacherous chain of command, protected by the cosmic distortion. They were the ghosts of his guilt, the proof that his failure to save the Triton's initial position had led to a greater, more crucial survival. The leader of the group, a thin man named Varric, who wore the tattered command patch of the Triton's chief engineer, stood over Kerrigan. He didn't offer sympathy, only a hard, pragmatic assessment. You are a ghost, pilot. The Mandate thinks you destroyed the Triumph for political gain. They think you are an agent of an external power. You committed treason and sabotage to reveal a truth no one will believe because the source is compromised. Varric's voice was low and steady. But we believe you. We saw the entity, and we know Renard's secrets. Varric handed Kerrigan a small, clean datapad. It held the full, reconstructed spectral map, corrected and stabilized by the Triton's deep-range sensors. It showed the entity's true form, its vector, and the chilling graph of its calculated prediction of human behavior. This is your final data spool, Kerrigan. This is the proof that the enemy is a technological mind that calculates betrayal and uses human guilt as fuel, Varric said. We cannot use this data. We are outlaws. You, however, were the only chaotic variable it could not predict. Kerrigan looked at the datapad, then back at the engineer. He was no longer the pilot who prioritized data over life. He was a piece of data himself, the only piece that didn't fit the equation. What do I do with it? Kerrigan asked, feeling the exhaustion of his new, terrifying freedom. You transmit it, Varric said simply. Not to the Mandate, not to the fleet. They would purge it as error. You send it to the civilian sector, to the outer perimeter trade guilds, to the journalists they silenced 3 years ago. You make the information chaotic enough that they can't contain it. You break the data chain. Kerrigan looked at his left arm, which would never again move with precision. He was crippled, an internal radiation burn guaranteed to kill him within the year, a fugitive who had lost everything but this singular, toxic truth. He was no longer capable of flying, fighting, or commanding. His failure had been complete, profound, and utterly necessary. He accepted the burden He had finally paid the cost of Manticore, not by seeking redemption, but by committing the ultimate necessary sin. Kerrigan spent the next 12 hours in agonizing focus, using the Triton's outdated but powerful deep-range broadcast array. He compiled the spectral map, the entity's chilling psychological assessment, the proof of Tarrant and Renard's calculated betrayal, and his own confession of sabotage and murder. He structured the transmission not as a military report, but as a fragmented narrative of terror and scientific impossibility, designed to ignite confusion and curiosity across 100 unsanctioned data networks. He was not seeking justice. Justice was a luxury for stable societies. He was seeking chaos, the only defense the species had against an enemy that understood predictability. When the final transmission sequence was confirmed, the small medbay felt hollowed out. Kerrigan's body was spent. His strength vanished, leaving only the dull, constant ache of damaged nerves. He was done. Varric leaned in, taking the datapad back. It's sent. The war will begin now, pilot. Not on the front lines, but in the data streams. You gave them the truth. Now they have to decide if they are ready to process it. Kerrigan nodded slowly. He had no more to prove. He was the end of the line. He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the life support, the manufactured safe air of his final sanctuary. He thought back to the beginning, to the terror on the Acheron, when the air had turned thin and metallic, like breathing static electricity through a mouthful of copper coins. That metallic air had been the taste of fear, of isolation, and of the fundamental laws of physics collapsing. Here, in the cold heart of the gravitational chaos, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, the air was clean, if meager. The fear was gone, the choices were made, the cost was paid. Kerrigan did not try to stand. He did not ask for a weapon. He had survived because he accepted his expendability, because he was chaotic, and because he had sacrificed everything, including the lie of a clean conscience. He was no longer trapped by guilt, nor by command, nor by the logic of the enemy. He simply existed. The final variable. He had run out of time, out of energy, and out of air, but the static was finally gone. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.